Hello friends, my name is JJ, and today I thought we would do something a little bit different. I wanted to make a video about this topic, but I didn't want to give the topic the seriousness of a typical JJ video, you know, with the script and the visuals and all of that stuff, because the topic I wanted to talk about today is a very silly topic that I think in some ways reflects something about the unseriousness of Canadian politics these days. So you see, there is a province in Canada called Alberta. And for one reason or another, the newspapers these days are very filled with stories about the supposed Alberta separatist movement. And I just want to say off the bat that there is no Alberta separatist movement. When asked by pollsters if they want to separate from Canada, Albertans answer overwhelmingly no. Pride in being Canadian is very high in Alberta, and actually, if anything, Albertans tend to poll slightly below average when it comes to people identifying more with their province than the country. There was a recent editorial in the National Post by Colby Kosh that I think sums up the situation quite well, so I will just read part of it to you. Alberta separatist political parties are gnats, invisible to the naked eye. They haven't come within an order of magnitude of passing any electoral test, despite lots of chances since the National Energy Program crisis. That was in the 1970s and marked the one time in Alberta history that they elected one separatist to their local parliament. Alberta separatists don't have recognizable intellectual leadership, none that you'd use those words to describe anyway. They haven't either captured or formed any popular journals of opinion. They haven't written catchy songs that Albertans bellow at each other in bars. The maple leaf flag is as popular here as anywhere. Try applying Tebbutt's cricket test. We Albertans cheer for Canada at the Olympics and sing "O Canada" with incomparable gusto at hockey games. We don't have an entire cultural vanguard that plays footsie with separatism. This is a reference to Quebec. The Alberta separatists don't have a permanent literature going back decades. There's no ready-made Alberta pantheon, no list of Alberta sovereigntist classics. So I think that sums it up quite well. Not only is there no organized separatist political movement in Alberta, there is not even the sort of cultural infrastructure that you would expect to sustain a separatist movement in the first place. So this being the case, it may surprise you to learn that for some reason Alberta will soon be having a referendum on separatism. It's actually a little bit ambiguous right now exactly what the referendum question will be. There are two, I guess, rival groups promoting rival questions at the moment. The situation is very silly because the first group of people are currently in the process of gathering enough signatures to put a very pro-Canada question before Alberta voters. Do you agree that Alberta should remain in Canada? And the reason why they even feel the need to put such a question before the voters is because, by their own admission, they are suffering under the belief that an Alberta separatism referendum was somehow inevitable. So it may as well be this. And then in response to this, you have this sort of right-wing conspiracy theorist type guy named Jeffrey Rath, who near as I can tell is the only open separatist in Alberta, and he is gathering signatures to put a more adversarial question on the ballot, which goes like this. Do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province in Canada? Alberta election law does not allow two very similar referendum questions to be asked on the same ballot, so ultimately only one of these two questions will actually make it before voters. Whatever referendum question winds up being asked, the vote will be held sometime in 2026, and spoiler alert, Albertans will vote overwhelmingly against separatism. So again, the question is, why is this even happening at all? And the reason it's happening at all is because Canadian politics is sort of descending into this sort of farcical soap opera state. So the big thing about Alberta is that it is very conservative. The province has consistently elected conservative provincial governments for nearly 50 unbroken years, and they have overwhelmingly elected conservatives to the national parliament for over 80 straight years. And when you have such a long period of one-party rule, it tends to warp the political culture in various ways. We know that Canada is a country that tends to have a strong conception of itself that's very much bound up in a sort of progressive ethos, a country that is very broadly liberal when it comes to things like socialized healthcare and gun control and abortion and all of that. And this can obviously make the Albertans feel like a bit of a cultural outlier in their own country. It shouldn't be overstated. I mean, there are lots of conservatives all across Canada, but the degree that Alberta is more conservative than anywhere else has become a sort of big part of that province's kind of self-conception. And it's definitely true that as liberal prime ministers keep getting elected nationally in Canada, that sense of Alberta difference continues to grow and grow. And over the decades, this has definitely given rise to a certain kind of like right-wing Alberta intellectual elite in that province. A lot of big-shot Canadian conservative pundits and academics and politicians and writers come from that province. And within this conservative elite, it has long been taken as an article of faith that the appropriate disposition for a conservative Alberta government is to sort of maximize its own autonomy and to be a force of resistance and defiance to the Liberal administration in Ottawa. You know, Ottawa's run by Liberals, and we're not going to let those Liberals bully us and tell us what to do. And I feel like over time, the press has kind of exaggerated what is basically just a partisan clash into like this national unity crisis. A lot of this is obviously very informed by what has been going on in Quebec for decades. Quebec, of course, is the only part of Canada that has a French-Canadian majority population. And that cultural distinction, particularly the linguistic distinction, has given the Quebecers a very distinct national identity and inspired the creation of many quite successful Quebec separatist political parties, as well as all of the sort of cultural infrastructure of a distinct people that Colby Kosh was mentioning in that article. And I don't know, just a certain type of Canadian has always been very fascinated with this idea where it's like, well, if there's separatists in the East, what if there was also separatists in the West? This idea of like, well, what if Canada is being sort of like torn apart at both ends by two equally aggrieved groups that feel equally alienated by Ottawa in the middle? This also evokes this kind of like weirdly romantic conception that Canada is like this very difficult country to keep together. You know, that it's like constantly being pulled apart in all directions because it's, you know, this like very fractious group of people who can't get along or agree on anything. I really don't think that that's a very accurate understanding of Canada. You know, like I said, when you look at polls across the country, satisfaction with being Canadian is generally quite high. But the idea that the Albertans' sort of ideological dissatisfaction with the Canadian national government is actually the manifestation of some sort of proto-separatist movement has proven to be a narrative that's just too delicious for the media to resist. And so you see it repeated again and again and again. Alberta separatism on the rise, the Alberta separatist movement, will this be the year the Alberta separatists break through? You know, again, these narratives continue despite the fact that there does not seem to be anything approximating an Alberta separatist movement, except for that one guy. The other day I even posted a tweet where I was like, has anyone in the history of Canada ever so much as even written one article in favor of Alberta separation? It really feels like this kind of collective delusion that we've all sort of psyoped ourselves into believing. You know, it's kind of like a boogeyman or a monster or sort of like mythical creature. You're always told it exists. There's no real proof that it exists, but we still live as if it exists and sort of cower in fear about this monster that, you know, might emerge from the shadows one day. Now, I will say that there are a lot of people who would argue that the Quebec separatist movement is not really a real thing either. The Quebecers have lots of separatist political parties, but there is a school of thought that argues that what they are doing is really just a kind of blackmail of the federal government. You know, this idea where it's like, oh, if we don't get enough money from the feds, you know, we might think about separating. And I think there is a sense within sort of right-wing Alberta world that that is not the worst political strategy to have. Alberta conservatives, like their current premier, Danielle Smith, certainly likes to sort of wave the flag of the Alberta separatist boogeyman in order to sort of justify getting what she wants from Ottawa. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, you might not like dealing with me, but you know, it's either me or the separatists. Certainly after Prime Minister Carney got elected, which was a huge disappointment to a lot of conservatives in Western Canada, You know, the Alberta sort of conservative elite, I think, really started ratcheting up their fear-mongering about the separatist menace just around the corner. You know, this idea like, well, Albertans can only be shut out of national power for so long before we start getting some ideas. Obviously, some small minority of people will vote for separation in the referendum, but I think pretty much everybody acknowledges that that is just a kind of symbolic middle finger that they're giving to Ottawa, as opposed to an actual sincere expression of political intent. I don't know, I just really find the whole thing so dopey. I don't even really fully buy the premise that Albertans even really want that much distance from Ottawa in the first place. For the last 20 years or so, the sort of things that the Alberta sort of conservative elite have demanded from Ottawa tend to be relatively, you know, minor things. Conservative elites in Alberta often say that Alberta should have its own pension plan, it should have its own provincial police force instead of the Mounties, and it should maybe pay less into the equalization program, which is this sort of somewhat socialistic sort of thing that Ottawa does, in which they gather revenues from some of the wealthier provinces and redistribute it to some of the poorer provinces. This has long been a sore spot for the Albertans because Albertans tend to be wealthier and thus generate a lot more tax revenue, which is in turn very much linked to the highly lucrative Alberta oil industry. Oil has become a very big raison d'etre to the Alberta right as well in recent years. You know, as the federal government in Ottawa presses for more aggressive climate change policies, the Conservatives in Alberta become very resistant to that because they feel like their economy has the most to lose. But beyond some of that stuff, I think in more ways than not, Albertans are pretty much in tune with sort of the broad Canadian mainstream. It can often be quite difficult to tell to what degree Albertans feel a certain way about government policy versus to what degree those feelings are only held by their very conservative political establishment. But certainly when it comes to things like healthcare or even broad social policy, they seem pretty much in tune with the Canadian mainstream. And again, you compare that to a place like Quebec, which just has such a visibly distinct political culture that is informed by a very distinctly sort of nationalist ethos, and frankly, a kind of ideological sort of left-wing sort of dimension that is quite noticeably different than what is mainstream in the rest of Canada. So that's basically all I have to say about Alberta separatism. It is not a real thing, it is mostly a sensationalistic media creation and a sort of paranoia that is kept alive for basically partisan political reasons. I often get a lot of requests to make a video on this topic, but I really don't like the idea of giving a serious video treatment to something that I just think is profoundly unserious. The idea that the Albertans will even hold a referendum on this phantom menace is such an indictment of the goofiness of Canadian politics these days. We are a country with so many serious problems that we need to deal with, and yet we are choosing to spend so much of our time and energy and brain power talking about this thing that, for all intents and purposes, just doesn't exist. I really think it has something to do with like the extent that we want politics to be like a big Hollywood movie now, you know, with like big drama and plots and high stakes and all these like dramatic characters and conflict. But you know, real life isn't always like that. Sometimes politics is just about trying to figure out healthcare policy and how to stimulate economic growth. As much as you might wish you lived in a more interesting timeline, unfortunately, not everything gets to be a big life or death existential battle. So let's hope the Albertans get this out of their system so they and the rest of the country can talk about something else. Something real, for a change.